좌측방 환자 1명, 환자 1명.
Before we step into this journey through one of the darkest days in modern history, I ask you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel, Echoes of History. If you want to uncover the stories that shaped our world, the moments we can never forget, your support helps us keep these voices alive. Now, let us go back to a Tuesday morning, September 11, 2001. The city of New York was wide awake. It was a bright, clear day, the kind of morning where the sky seemed endless and blue. Commuters rushed into subways and buses, children grabbed their backpacks for school, and office workers flooded into lower Manhattan. The twin towers of the World Trade Center stood tall, glistening in the morning sun. For many New Yorkers, they were more than buildings. They were landmarks, a symbol of economic strength, and part of the city's identity. But while millions prepared for a normal day, a different plan was already in motion. At airports in Boston, Washington, and Newark, 19 men boarded 4 flights. To the security staff and fellow passengers, they looked like ordinary travelers. They carried only small bags, nothing to draw attention. Yet hidden inside those bags were the tools that would bring terror to the world: knives, box cutters, and the will to turn civilian planes into weapons. The hijackers had trained for this day for years. They had learned how to blend in, how to behave like average travelers. Some had even attended flight schools in the United States. What no one knew was that they had been sent by Al-Qaeda, an extremist network led by Osama bin Laden, a man who had already declared war on America. At 8:46 a.m., the silence of the morning was broken. American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The explosion ripped through the building, sending fire and smoke pouring from the gaping wound. On the streets below, people stopped in their tracks. Some screamed, some cried, others simply stared. Television networks quickly broke into regular programming to show live footage of the burning tower. At first, most thought it was a terrible accident. A plane crash. A tragedy, yes, but not an attack. That illusion shattered just 17 minutes later. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower, exploding on impact. The fireball was captured live on television, seen by millions around the world in real time. Suddenly, it was clear, this was not an accident. This was deliberate. This was war. The scene inside the towers was one of chaos and terror. Thousands of office workers were trapped above the impact zones. Stairwells were blocked. Elevators were destroyed. Some tried to descend through smoke-filled corridors, holding wet cloths to their faces. Others broke windows, waving desperately for help that could never reach them. Firefighters and police officers rushed into the buildings, climbing floor after floor in their heavy gear, knowing that time was short but refusing to turn back. At 9:37 a.m., horror struck again. American Airlines Flight 77 slammed into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. military. The symbol of American defense was burning. Thick black smoke rose above Washington, D.C., spreading fear across the nation's capital. Then came the final act of defiance. United Airlines Flight 93, headed for Washington, never reached its target. The passengers on board had learned what was happening from phone calls to loved ones. They knew that other planes had been turned into weapons. And so, ordinary men and women made an extraordinary decision. They fought back against the hijackers. Their struggle ended when the plane crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at 10:03 a.m. Their sacrifice saved countless lives, preventing another devastating strike, likely against the White House or the Capitol. Meanwhile, in New York, the towers burned. Firefighters pushed upward, civilians rushed downward, and on the streets, people looked up in horror. Then, at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower began to fall. It collapsed floor by floor, turning steel and concrete into dust in less than 12 seconds. A thunderous roar echoed through Manhattan, followed by a wall of debris that swallowed everything in its path. Survivors ran through streets coated in ash. Papers, glass, and pieces of concrete rained from the sky. People stumbled, choking, their faces gray with dust. But there was no time to recover. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed. In less than 2 hours, both towers, icons of New York and symbols of global commerce, were gone. The destruction was beyond imagination. The World Trade Center complex, once bustling with thousands of workers and visitors, lay in ruins. Buildings nearby were destroyed or heavily damaged. Fires burned uncontrollably. First responders searched through the rubble, desperately trying to find survivors. But the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives that day, Americans and foreigners alike. They were office workers, firefighters, police officers, flight crews, passengers, and ordinary citizens. They came from more than 90 nations. Each life had its own story, its own dreams, cut short in an instant. Families waited by phones, hoping for news that never came. Loved ones scanned missing posters taped to walls and fences, clinging to hope amid despair. The images traveled around the globe. Children in classrooms, workers in offices, people sitting in their homes, all witnessed the towers burning and collapsing live on television. The attacks weren't just an assault on America, they were a spectacle of terror designed to be seen by the entire world. And it worked. The world was shocked, horrified, and afraid. As night fell, New York was covered in smoke. Fires still burned at Ground Zero. The Pentagon smoldered. A quiet field in Pennsylvania was scarred by wreckage. The United States, the most powerful nation on Earth, had been struck in a way no one could have imagined. President George W. Bush addressed the nation that evening from the Oval Office. His voice was steady, but the gravity was unmistakable. Today, he said, our way of life, our very freedom, came under attack. He promised that those responsible would face justice, and that America would not falter. But in living rooms across the country, fear lingered. If 4 planes could be hijacked, what else could happen? If the Twin Towers and the Pentagon could be struck, what was safe? Airports shut down, skies empty, and cities across the world braced for the unknown. This was more than an attack on buildings. It was an attack on symbols. New York, the city of commerce, Washington, the seat of power, and the passengers of Flight 93, who turned tragedy into heroism. The message from the attackers was clear: no one was untouchable. That day, America was wounded. But out of the smoke and ash, a new resolve began to form. A determination that the world would soon feel. Because the question was no longer just what happened. It was who did this, and what would America do next? The smoke still hung heavy over lower Manhattan. Fires raged in the ruins of the Twin Towers, and thousands of first responders searched desperately for survivors. Families stood outside hospitals, clutching photographs of loved ones. Across America, television screens replayed the same images again and again. The planes striking, the towers burning, the towers falling. The question burned in every mind: who was behind this? Within hours, intelligence officials had a name: Al-Qaeda. This was not the first time the group had targeted America. In 1998, Al-Qaeda had bombed U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing more than 200 people. In 2000, the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy destroyer, had been attacked in Yemen, killing 17 sailors. Both times, the name of Al-Qaeda's leader surfaced: Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden was no stranger to the U.S. government. In the 1980s, he had fought against the Soviets in Afghanistan, supported by money and weapons from America and its allies. But after the war, he turned his anger against the West. From his base in Afghanistan, protected by the Taliban regime, he issued fatwas declaring jihad against the United States. He claimed America was corrupt, that it defiled the holy lands of Islam by stationing troops in Saudi Arabia, and that it exploited Muslim nations. For years, his threats were dismissed as the rantings of a distant extremist. But on September 11, 2001, his words became reality. 19 of his followers had carried out the deadliest terrorist attack in history, using nothing more than planes and determination. In Washington, President George W. Bush faced the greatest crisis of his presidency. That evening, as he addressed the nation, he made it clear: America would not sit idle. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them, he declared. It was the beginning of what would soon be called the War on Terror. The next morning, newspapers carried the same headline across the world: America under attack. The images of the burning towers were on every front page. But beneath the grief, anger was rising. Americans demanded justice. They wanted those responsible hunted down. In New York, the rescue efforts continued. Firefighters dug through the rubble with bare hands, searching for signs of life. But hope was fading. The pile, as it came to be known, was a mountain of twisted steel and concrete, burning for weeks. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and toxic fumes. For many first responders, those fumes would bring health problems for years to come. Yet in those first days, all that mattered was finding survivors. Meanwhile, investigators worked quickly. Within days, the FBI released photos of the hijackers. Their identities were pieced together from flight manifests, security footage, and records. Most were from Saudi Arabia. All were linked to Al-Qaeda. Americans were stunned. How had these men lived, trained, and plotted inside the United States without raising alarms? The scope of the attack was chilling. It wasn't just the hijackings. The terrorists had lived in American cities, taken flying lessons, and communicated with Al-Qaeda operatives overseas, all while hiding in plain sight. Intelligence agencies had missed the warning signs, and now nearly 3,000 people were dead. Around the world, nations rallied to America's side. France declared, "We are all Americans." In London, thousands gathered outside the U.S. Embassy, laying flowers and holding vigils. NATO invoked Article 5 of its charter for the first time in history, declaring that an attack on one member was an attack on all. But while the world grieved with America, fear also spread. If such an attack could happen in New York and Washington, what was to stop it from happening in London, Paris, or Tokyo? Airports around the globe tightened security. Armed guards patrolled train stations. Governments braced for more. In the United States, life changed overnight. The skies, once filled with planes, were eerily empty. Commercial flights had been grounded. Families canceled vacations. Travelers endured new, stricter security checks. Metal detectors beeped, bags were searched, and cockpit doors were reinforced. A new agency, the Transportation Security Administration (TSA), was created to guard the skies. But the changes went beyond airports. The attacks had struck deep into America's psyche. Ordinary people eyed their neighbors with suspicion. Mosques were vandalized, and Muslims across the country faced harassment and fear. While leaders urged Americans not to blame an entire faith, anger and confusion often boiled over. Inside the White House, the Bush administration was already making plans. The CIA gathered intelligence, linking the plot directly to Osama bin Laden. The Taliban, rulers of Afghanistan, were accused of sheltering him and his followers. Diplomats demanded that the Taliban hand him over. The Taliban refused. The world watched, knowing what was coming: war. Even as the United States prepared for military action, the pain of September 11 lingered. Families wandered the streets near Ground Zero, carrying photos of loved ones, mothers, fathers, children, co-workers. Posters of the missing covered walls and lampposts. Churches and mosques filled with mourners. Candlelight vigils lit the night. The nation grieved, but it also hardened. Patriotic songs played on radios. American flags waved from porches, cars, and shop windows. Blood banks overflowed with donors. For a brief moment, America stood united, shaken, but resolute. And yet, beneath that unity lay a dangerous mix of grief and rage. Americans demanded not only justice, but revenge. The memory of the burning towers was etched into their minds. The question was no longer if America would strike back, but when and where. In the weeks after September 11th, America was restless. Streets still smelled of smoke in Lower Manhattan. Families still clung to fading hopes of survivors, even as recovery crews pulled nothing but rubble and ash from the ruins of the Twin Towers. But while grief filled the air, so did a new determination. President George W. Bush's words echoed across the country: "We will not tire, we will not falter, and we will not fail." Those weren't just promises to the American people, they were warnings to the world. The attacks had come from Al-Qaeda, a group hidden and protected within Afghanistan. And America was preparing to respond with full force. Intelligence agencies traced the plot back to Osama bin Laden, who lived under the protection of the Taliban, Afghanistan's ruling regime. Demands were sent: hand him over. The Taliban refused. Their leader, Mullah Omar, insisted there was no solid proof of bin Laden's guilt. But for America, patience had run out. The images of burning towers were still fresh, and the nation was united in anger. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States, with support from Britain and other allies, launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Cruise missiles streaked across the night sky over Kabul. American bombers targeted Taliban training camps and al-Qaeda hideouts. The world watched live as the war began. For many Americans, it was a moment of justice. Newspapers carried bold headlines: U.S. strikes back. Television screens showed the glow of explosions against the Afghan mountains. The message was clear: the hunt for bin Laden had begun. On the ground, the war unfolded quickly. The Taliban, though fierce, were no match for American airpower combined with Afghan resistance groups known as the Northern Alliance. Villages and cities fell one by one. Kabul, the Afghan capital, was abandoned by Taliban forces in November. Kandahar, their spiritual stronghold, collapsed soon after. Within weeks, the Taliban regime was gone, swept aside by the US-led invasion. Yet one man remained out of reach: Osama bin Laden. By December, intelligence suggested he had fled to the Tora Bora Mountains near the Pakistan border. American forces closed in, dropping bombs and sending special operations units to seal the area. For days, caves and tunnels were pounded with explosives. Bin Laden was believed to be trapped. But somehow, he slipped away. Whether through secret mountain paths, or aided by local fighters, he escaped into Pakistan. The most wanted man in the world was gone. Still, in America, the early months of war were seen as a success. The Taliban had been toppled. Training camps had been destroyed. Al-Qaeda was scattered. President Bush's approval ratings soared. The American people, wounded by 9/11, felt that justice had begun. But beneath the triumph, shadows were forming. Afghanistan was not truly at peace. Taliban fighters melted into villages, waiting for their chance to return. Al-Qaeda leaders found refuge across the border in Pakistan. And as America celebrated victories, the seeds of a long, painful war were being planted. At home, the United States transformed. New laws expanded surveillance powers. The Patriot Act gave the government greater authority to monitor phone calls, emails, and bank accounts, all in the name of preventing another attack. Airport security became stricter than ever before. Passengers removed shoes, belts, and jackets. Bottled water and sharp objects were banned. Cockpit doors were reinforced, turning air travel into a constant reminder of that September day. For Muslim communities in America, life became harder. Hate crimes spiked. Mosques faced vandalism. Innocent people were questioned, detained, or harassed simply because of their names, skin color, or religion. Though many Americans stood against this discrimination, fear often outweighed compassion. Meanwhile, across the world, the war on terror spread. U.S. forces hunted al-Qaeda operatives in Yemen, Somalia, and other corners of the globe. Allies joined in, offering troops, intelligence, and resources. Yet as the war widened, so did the questions. How long would it last? How far would it go? And could it truly bring peace? By 2002, the ruins of Ground Zero in New York had been cleared. Families gathered at memorials, clutching photos of loved ones. Firefighters who had survived carried the weight of fallen comrades. The site where the Twin Towers once stood was now a scar, empty, silent, waiting for a new chapter. But America's eyes were no longer only on Afghanistan. In Washington, new voices began to rise. Officials spoke of another threat, another enemy, one that had not struck on 9/11 but was accused of harboring dangerous weapons: Iraq. The story of 9/11 had ignited a fire that would not stop at Afghanistan. The war on terror was growing. And soon, the United States would find itself preparing for another invasion, one that would change the Middle East forever. The war in Afghanistan had toppled the Taliban, scattered al-Qaeda, and sent Osama bin Laden fleeing into the shadows. In Washington, the Bush administration claimed victory. But even as American troops dug in among the Afghan mountains, the eyes of U.S. leaders began to drift elsewhere, toward Iraq. The memory of September 11 was still raw. The images of the burning towers and the Pentagon in flames still haunted the nation. For the White House, the attacks were proof that America's enemies would stop at nothing. President George W. Bush and his advisors argued that waiting for another strike was too dangerous. They insisted America had to act first, to eliminate threats before they could reach U.S. soil. Iraq, under dictator Saddam Hussein, became the focus. For years, Saddam had been a thorn in America's side. He had fought a brutal war with Iran in the 1980s, invaded Kuwait in 1990, and survived a US-led coalition that pushed his army back in the Gulf War. His regime was notorious for cruelty, torture chambers, mass killings, and the use of chemical weapons against his own people. Now, in the tense atmosphere after 9/11, officials claimed that Saddam posed a new kind of danger. They argued that he was hiding weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, or biological arms, that could one day be handed to terrorists like al-Qaeda. There was little direct evidence, but the fear of another catastrophe made the case powerful. In speeches, President Bush linked Saddam Hussein to the broader war on terror. "We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud," he warned. The message was simple. After 9/11, America could not afford to take chances. The world watched closely. Some allies supported the U.S. position, while others grew skeptical. The United Nations debated. Inspectors searched Iraq but found no clear evidence of banned weapons. Still, the drumbeat for war grew louder in Washington. By early 2003, America was preparing for another invasion. Meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan was far from over. Though the Taliban had lost power, they had not been destroyed. Fighters regrouped in the countryside, blending into villages. Al-Qaeda operatives found safe havens in Pakistan. American soldiers patrolled unfamiliar terrain, facing ambushes and roadside bombs. The war that had begun as swift and decisive was turning into a long, uncertain conflict. Yet the focus of the Bush administration shifted more and more toward Baghdad. Officials argued that Saddam Hussein and 9/11 were connected, though direct links were weak. Still, The memory of the attacks gave the arguments weight. Fear was a powerful tool, and many Americans believed Iraq could be the next threat. In March 2003, the United States launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. Bombs rained down on Baghdad in a campaign called Shock and Awe. Television screens lit up with images of explosions flashing across the night sky. U.S. forces advanced rapidly, and within weeks, Saddam's regime collapsed. His statues were pulled down in city squares. By December, Saddam Hussein himself was captured, dragged from a hole in the ground by American soldiers. For a moment, it seemed like another swift victory. But beneath the surface, Iraq was unraveling. Sectarian violence exploded between Sunni and Shia groups. Militias rose, car bombs tore through marketplaces, and U.S. troops found themselves caught in a brutal insurgency. The promise of weapons of mass destruction proved hollow, none were found. As Iraq descended into chaos, critics questioned why the war had been fought. Families of soldiers asked what their sons and daughters had died for. Around the world, anti-war protests grew. But in Washington, leaders insisted the mission was part of the larger war on terror, a war that had begun on 9/11. Back in Afghanistan, the Taliban quietly grew stronger. As America poured resources into Iraq, Afghanistan was left unstable. Villages slipped back under Taliban influence. Poppy fields, fueling the heroin trade, flourished. Osama bin Laden remained at large, hidden across the border in Pakistan. The man responsible for 9/11 had escaped justice, even as America fought 2 wars in his name. At home, the United States was changing in other ways. The Department of Homeland Security was created, reshaping government around the fight against terrorism. Surveillance expanded. Citizens were told to stay alert, to report suspicious behavior. Fear became a constant background hum in daily life. Airports, once symbols of freedom and travel, became symbols of suspicion and control. Shoes came off, liquids were banned, passengers endured long lines and body scans. Every flight was a reminder of what had happened on September 11th. Yet even with all the changes, Americans still carried the scars of that day. Families of the victims visited memorials, placing flowers at ground zero. First responders, many suffering from illnesses caused by the toxic dust, struggled for recognition and care. The phrase, "never forget," became a national mantra, engraved on bumper stickers, posters, and monuments. But as the wars dragged on, "never forget" was tested. The unity of September 2001 began to fade, replaced by division. Some supported the wars as necessary for security. Others saw them as endless, unwinnable, and costly in blood and treasure. By the mid-2000s, America found itself in a bind. Afghanistan was unstable. Iraq was in chaos. The hunt for bin Laden had stalled. The war on terror, meant to deliver justice for 9/11, had become a sprawling, uncertain campaign. And through it all, the memory of September 11th remained, the spark that had ignited 2 wars, reshaped America's politics, and transformed the world order. But the story of 9/11 was not only about wars abroad. It was also about the lives left behind, the families, the survivors, the children who grew up without parents, and the first responders who carried invisible wounds. Their stories would remind America, year after year, of the human cost of that September morning. The year was 2004. In New York, the skyline still bore a scar where the Twin Towers once stood. At Ground Zero, construction fences surrounded the pit, and families gathered on anniversaries, reading the names of the nearly 3,000 souls who had perished. The words, "Never Forget," echoed across the country, carved into memorials, etched onto bumper stickers, spoken in classrooms. But even as America vowed remembrance, the nation was learning that memory carried a heavy price. In Iraq, the promise of a quick victory had vanished. After Saddam Hussein's fall, chaos filled the vacuum. Militias fought for power, sectarian violence exploded, and American soldiers found themselves targets of car bombs and improvised explosive devices, IEDs that tore through Humvees and convoys. What was meant to be liberation became occupation. Streets turned into battlefields, and soldiers who had expected to be greeted as heroes were now seen as invaders. Every night, the news brought grim images: smoke rising over Baghdad, grieving Iraqi families, flag-draped coffins arriving home at Dover Air Force Base. America's war on terror was consuming lives, money, and trust. Meanwhile, Afghanistan, the original front of the war, was slipping from view. The Taliban, though defeated in open battle, never truly disappeared. They blended back into villages, regrouping, recruiting, waiting. Corruption plagued the Afghan government, and many civilians, caught between Taliban threats and U.S. military raids, lost faith in the promises of democracy. The man at the center of it all, Osama bin Laden, was still free. Despite America's vast power, despite billions spent on intelligence and war, the mastermind of September 11th had not been captured. In videos released from hidden locations, bin Laden appeared calm, even triumphant, mocking the United States and urging Muslims worldwide to rise against it. His voice was a cruel reminder: justice remained unfinished. At home, Americans lived in a changed world. The Department of Homeland Security had reshaped daily life. Color-coded terror alerts flashed on television screens: green, yellow, orange, red, each level signaling the perceived risk of attack. Air travel became a gauntlet of security checks. Shoes came off, belts came off, liquids were banned. Travelers lined up barefoot, clutching clear plastic bags, every trip a reminder of that terrible day. Surveillance expanded. The Patriot Act gave the government power to monitor phone calls, emails, and bank records. Supporters called it necessary for safety. Critics called it a threat to freedom. The debate split the nation: how much liberty should be sacrificed for security? For Muslim Americans, the post-9/11 world was harsher still. Mosques were monitored. Communities faced suspicion. Hate crimes rose, fueled by fear and ignorance. Innocent families were questioned at airports, detained, sometimes harassed simply because of their faith. Though many Americans defended their neighbors, the shadow of prejudice stretched wide. Yet in the midst of fear, there was also resilience. Survivors of the attacks shared their stories in schools, ensuring new generations understood what had happened. Children who had lost parents grew up determined to honor them through service, charity, or simply by living fully. Firefighters and police officers, scarred by the memories of that day, built charities to support their fallen comrades' families. The rebuilding of Ground Zero became a symbol of this resilience. Plans for a new tower, taller than the original World Trade Center, were unveiled. Architects debated designs, families demanded dignity, and New Yorkers argued fiercely over how best to honor the dead. The site was more than construction, it was a national wound being stitched, one steel beam at a time. But while the site of destruction rose anew, wars abroad dragged on. In Iraq, the insurgency grew deadlier. In Fallujah, U.S. Marines fought brutal street battles, facing ambushes in narrow alleys. In Afghanistan, remote valleys became graveyards for young soldiers. Victory, once promised as swift, seemed far away, if possible at all. The cost mounted. Thousands of American troops were killed. Tens of thousands more returned with wounds, some visible, many hidden. Post-traumatic stress haunted veterans, nightmares replaying roadside bombs and firefights. Hospitals filled with men and women whose lives had been forever altered. And still, every September, the nation paused. Families gathered at memorials, reading the names of those lost on 9/11. Bells tolled at the precise moments the planes had struck. The world stopped to remember. Yet remembrance was not enough to answer the growing question, had justice truly been done? By 2006, America was deep in two wars with no clear end. Afghanistan was unstable, Iraq was burning, bin Laden was free. The unity that had carried the nation after 9/11 was fading into division. Some argued the wars kept America safe. Others believed they had become endless quagmires, draining blood and treasure for goals that slipped further away each year. For the families who had lost loved ones on 9/11, the pain remained raw. Some found comfort in memorials and tributes. Others grew bitter, questioning why their grief had led to wars that created even more loss. The shadow of that September morning stretched across continents, reshaping lives in ways no one had imagined. The story of 9/11 was no longer only about a single day. It was about a chain of events that reshaped the world, a moment of terror that led to years of war, sacrifice, and struggle. And as America moved further from the day itself, the question grew louder: would there ever be an end to the shadow it had cast? Won by the mid-2000s, the War on Terror had become the defining story of America. 5 years had passed since the morning of September 11, 2001, but for millions of people, it felt as though the day had never ended. The images of the burning towers, the collapse, the screams and sirens, they lived on in memory, in news reports, and in the daily security routines of every American. In Afghanistan, American forces remained locked in battle. The Taliban, once ousted from Kabul, had re-emerged with a vengeance. They no longer fought in open fields. Instead, they struck with roadside bombs, ambushes, and suicide attacks. Afghan villages became contested spaces, where U.S. soldiers struggled to separate friends from foes. Despite billions spent on reconstruction, progress was fragile. Corruption ate away at the Afghan government, and many citizens began to question whether life had truly improved since the fall of the Taliban. Meanwhile, Iraq was tearing itself apart. After Saddam Hussein's capture, sectarian violence exploded. Sunni insurgents fought Shia militias, while al-Qaeda in Iraq, a brutal offshoot of the original network, carried out devastating bombings. American soldiers found themselves caught in a storm of chaos, facing an enemy that blended into the population. What had begun as a mission to find weapons of mass destruction had turned into a grinding war for survival. Back home, the American public grew weary. The promise of quick victories in Afghanistan and Iraq had faded into years of bloodshed. Newspapers published images of flag-draped coffins, and nightly news broadcasts carried casualty counts. Questions grew louder. Was this the right path? Was the war on terror truly keeping America safe? And always, one haunting question remained. Where was Osama bin Laden? Nearly every intelligence agency in the world was hunting him. Reports suggested he was hiding along the mountainous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some claimed he was in caves, others said in remote villages, protected by tribal loyalties. Occasionally, his voice surfaced in video messages, his words taunting the West. He called on Muslims to rise against America, mocked U.S. failures, and reminded the world that the mastermind of 9/11 was still alive. For ordinary Americans, bin Laden became both a symbol and a ghost. His face was plastered on FBI most wanted posters, yet he seemed untouchable. Soldiers risked their lives daily, but the man they sought always slipped away. It was as though 9/11 remained an open wound, unhealed as long as he was free. In Washington, the political landscape shifted. The wars abroad and the struggle at home became central issues in elections. By 2008, with the conflicts dragging on and the economy faltering, Americans voted for change. Barack Obama rose to the presidency, promising to end the war in Iraq and refocus on Afghanistan. The war, he said, that America had to win. Obama inherited a nation tired of war but still haunted by fear. He promised a new strategy, one that would rebuild alliances and target terrorists with precision rather than broad invasions. Yet the shadow of 9/11 loomed over every decision. The attacks had reshaped American politics, making security a constant priority. In Afghanistan, the fight deepened. U.S. forces surged in number, attempting to push back the Taliban. Villages were cleared, roads patrolled, but the insurgency proved stubborn. Every gain seemed temporary. For each Taliban fighter killed, another appeared. The war became a cycle without end. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, questions grew sharper. Intelligence increasingly suggested that bin Laden was hiding not in Afghanistan, but across the border. Pakistan was officially an ally in the war on terror, but its tribal regions were lawless, difficult to control. Some whispered that elements within Pakistan's government protected bin Laden, using him as leverage in their own regional struggles. In America, security at home remained tight. Airports continued strict screenings. Surveillance expanded online, as new technologies gave agencies the power to monitor digital communications. For many, the world felt safer than in 2001. For others, it felt smaller, more controlled, less free. And still, every September 11th, the nation paused. At Ground Zero, bells tolled at 8:46 a.m., the exact moment the first plane struck the North Tower. Names of the dead were read aloud, one by one, a solemn roll call of lives stolen. Families wept, survivors embraced, and the world remembered. But remembrance was not enough. The promise made in 2001, to bring the architects of the attacks to justice, remained unfulfilled. Bin Laden's ghost haunted not only the families of the victims but the entire nation. Each year he remained free was a reminder that the war was not yet won. By the late 2000s, Americans were asking new questions. Could the war on terror ever end? Could a single man be worth the cost of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars? Or had the attacks of 9/11 created a cycle that would never be broken? The answers remained elusive. But one thing was certain. Until Osama bin Laden was found, the story of September 11th was not complete. And far away, in a compound hidden deep inside Pakistan, the man who had launched the deadliest terrorist attack in history was waiting. His time in the shadows was running out. For nearly a decade, Osama bin Laden had lived as a ghost. His voice appeared in videotapes, his face on wanted posters, his name on every American's lips. Yet no one could find him. The most powerful military in the world, with satellites circling the Earth and spies across continents, could not capture a man hiding somewhere in South Asia. It was a humiliation America could not forget. But in 2010, the hunt finally began to narrow. The trail did not start with bin Laden himself, but with his couriers. Intelligence agencies had long believed that bin Laden avoided phones and the internet, knowing they could be tracked. Instead, he relied on trusted messengers to deliver information. One of those men, known by the nickname Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, became the key. After years of surveillance, CIA analysts tracked al-Kuwaiti to a mysterious compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Unlike the modest homes around it, this compound stood out. It was surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire. There were no phone lines, no internet connections. The windows were covered, and despite the secrecy, the property was far larger than anything a man like al-Kuwaiti should own. For months, CIA operatives observed the compound. They noticed that while children played in the courtyard, a tall man sometimes walked in the shadows. He never left the house. He never showed his face. To the analysts in Langley, Virginia, one thought grew louder: could this be bin Laden? The evidence was circumstantial. There was no photograph, no recording, no proof. But to President Barack Obama and his advisors, the case was compelling. After years of searching, they might have found the man who had haunted America since 2001. The decision was not simple. If bin Laden was inside, the compound was deep in Pakistani territory, just a short distance from the country's military academy. Pakistan was a U.S. ally, but also a nation where parts of the government had been accused of sympathizing with extremists. Telling Pakistan risked leaking the secret. Acting without their permission risked sparking a crisis between two nuclear-armed states. The choice was made. The mission would be secret, unilateral, and daring. In the spring of 2011, as the intelligence case grew stronger, Obama gathered his national security team. Options were laid out: a drone strike that could destroy the compound, or a ground raid that could capture or kill bin Laden. A drone strike was cleaner but left no proof. A raid was riskier but offered certainty. After tense debate, the president gave the order: go with the raid. Across the ocean, in a quiet base, SEAL Team 6 prepared. These were America's most elite warriors, trained for the most dangerous missions. They rehearsed for weeks, building mock-ups of the compound, memorizing every corner, every wall, every angle. They knew the risks. If anything went wrong, they could be captured or killed, sparking an international incident. But none hesitated. For them, the mission was personal. They had grown up with the memory of 9/11. Some had lost friends in the wars that followed. Now they had a chance to close the story. On May 1, 2011, 2 stealth helicopters lifted into the night sky from Afghanistan, carrying the SEALs toward Abbottabad. Inside, the men sat in silence, their hearts pounding. Below them stretched the darkened landscape of Pakistan. The world was asleep, unaware that history was about to be made. As the compound came into view, the first helicopter hovered to land. But suddenly, disaster struck. The rotor wash caused the aircraft to lose lift. It slammed into the ground inside the compound's walls. Dust and debris filled the air. For a moment, chaos threatened the mission. But the SEALs leapt out, regrouping instantly. Training took over. The second helicopter landed safely, and the raid pressed forward. Explosions tore open doors. Gunfire cracked the silence. Room by room, the SEALs cleared the compound. Women and children screamed, huddling in corners. Couriers and guards tried to resist, but were quickly overwhelmed. Finally, on the top floor, they found him. A tall figure, bearded, wearing a traditional robe. The man who had eluded the world for a decade stood face to face with America's most elite warriors. With a short burst of gunfire, the mission ended. Osama bin Laden was dead. The SEALs gathered his body, along with computers, documents, and hard drives. They moved swiftly, knowing Pakistani forces could arrive at any moment. Within minutes, they were gone, lifting into the night sky, leaving behind a burning wreck of the crashed helicopter as the only sign of their presence. Back in Washington, President Obama and his team had watched the raid unfold in tense silence. When the confirmation came, Geronimo EKIA, enemy killed in action, the room exhaled. A 10-year hunt was over. That night, Obama addressed the nation. His words carried across the world. Justice has been done. Crowds gathered outside the White House and in Times Square, waving flags, singing, chanting, USA. USA. For many, it felt like a wound had finally begun to heal. The man who had orchestrated September 11th, who had murdered thousands of innocents, was no more. Yet even in victory, questions lingered. Bin Laden had been found not in a cave, but in a comfortable house in a Pakistani city. How had he lived undetected for so long, just steps away from Pakistan's military academy? Did anyone protect him? Did anyone know? Those mysteries remained unsolved. Still, for the United States, the mission was a triumph. After years of fear, grief, and anger, after wars that had cost so much, America had delivered on its promise. The hunt for Osama bin Laden was over. But the story of 9/11 was not yet finished. The news spread like wildfire. In the late hours of May 1, 2011, and into the early morning of May 2, Americans poured into the streets. Outside the White House, in New York's Times Square, at Ground Zero itself, crowds gathered in celebration. They waved flags, sang the national anthem, and chanted, USA. USA. As though a great weight had finally been lifted from the nation's shoulders. For 10 long years, the face of Osama bin Laden had haunted America. Now, that face was gone. For the families of 9/11 victims, the moment was powerful. Some wept with relief, saying they finally felt justice had been done. Others said closure was impossible, that no death could bring back what had been taken on that September morning. Still, the news offered something they had long prayed for: an end to the search for the man who had murdered their loved ones. President Barack Obama's announcement was broadcast across the globe: "Justice has been done." His words echoed the promise made in 2001, that America would not rest until those responsible for 9/11 were brought to account. In living rooms, in bars, in military bases, Americans felt a rare sense of unity. Yet even in triumph, the reality was complicated. The war on terror did not end with bin Laden's death. The Taliban still fought in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda had spread to Yemen, Somalia, North Africa, and beyond. A new generation of extremists was already rising, inspired by bin Laden's legacy. Killing the man did not kill the movement. In Washington, debates erupted. Some argued that bin Laden's death proved America's wars had been worth it. Others said it showed the opposite, that targeted intelligence and small teams of special forces could succeed where large-scale invasions had failed. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had cost trillions of dollars and countless lives, yet in the end, a handful of commandos had achieved the victory that two armies could not. The handling of bin Laden's body also stirred controversy. Within hours of his death, U.S. officials confirmed he had been buried at sea. The decision was made to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for extremists. But in the shadows of secrecy, conspiracy theories flourished. Some doubted the official story. Others demanded to see photos as proof. The White House refused, calling the images too graphic and dangerous to release. In Pakistan, the raid sparked outrage. The world learned that bin Laden had lived for years in Abbottabad, just down the road from Pakistan's military academy. How could the country's intelligence services not have known? Were they incompetent, or complicit? The United States had launched the raid without telling Pakistan, fearing leaks. While many in America celebrated, relations between the two countries sank to a new low. For the U.S. military and intelligence community, the mission was a triumph, but also a reminder of the complexity of the fight. Al-Qaeda was weakened, but not destroyed. Its leaders still plotted from safe havens. And as the Arab Spring unfolded across the Middle East, instability created fresh opportunities for extremists to thrive. Back in America, the death of bin Laden marked a symbolic turning point. It was proof that even after a decade, justice could be served. But it also raised a deeper question: what now? The wars abroad continued. In Afghanistan, the Taliban regrouped, launching deadly attacks against US and NATO troops. Villages saw violence year after year, with no end in sight. In Iraq, sectarian divisions grew, setting the stage for new waves of conflict. At home, Americans struggled with the cost of war. Tens of thousands of soldiers returned with wounds both visible and invisible. Prosthetic limbs, wheelchairs, and scars told one story. Nightmares, anxiety, and depression told another. The wars of 9/11 were not fought only overseas, they lived inside the minds and bodies of the men and women who served. Ground Zero, once a pit of rubble, was transforming. The new One World Trade Center, also called the Freedom Tower, began to rise. Each beam of steel symbolized resilience. Each floor built higher than the last was a statement: America had been wounded, but not broken. By 2014, the tower would stand as the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, a glittering reminder of both loss and strength. Still, beneath the new skyline, the old questions remained. Could America ever truly heal from 9/11? Could justice for one man erase the pain of thousands of families? Could wars abroad bring peace at home? For many, the answer was no. Bin Laden's death was a milestone, but not an ending. The shadow of September 11th stretched far beyond one man. It had reshaped America's politics, society, and future. It had altered the course of nations. And even as crowds cheered his death, the world remained uneasy, bracing for what might come next. Because while one chapter had closed, the story of 9/11, and its consequences, was still being written. When the world first heard that Osama bin Laden had been killed, many believed the war on terror was finally nearing its end. Yet, history rarely closes so neatly. Bin Laden's death in 2011 was a symbolic victory, but it did not erase the networks, ideologies, and power vacuums that 9/11 had unleashed. If anything, the decade after his death revealed something even darker. The war on terror had transformed, and new threats were rising from its ashes. Afghanistan, the country where it had all begun, was still burning. Despite years of US and NATO operations, the Taliban had not been destroyed. They had adapted. They hid in rural villages, operated from across the border in Pakistan, and waited patiently. Each year, their attacks grew bolder. Roadside bombs, suicide missions, and ambushes turned the war into a grinding stalemate. For American soldiers on the ground, Afghanistan became less about winning and more about surviving. The Afghan people paid the highest price. Entire generations grew up families torn apart. Villagers feared both Taliban coalition airstrikes. Promises of democracy and progress often collided with corruption and poverty. The dream of a free and stable Afghanistan seemed to slip further away, even as American presidents promised to stay the course. Meanwhile, Iraq was unraveling. The US invasion of 2003 had toppled Saddam Hussein, but it had also fractured the country. Sectarian violence exploded between Sunni and Shia groups. Corruption weakened the government, and in the chaos, a brutal new force emerged: ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Born from the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS took terrorism to horrifying new levels. They declared a caliphate, captured cities like Mosul and Raqqa, and used social media to spread propaganda worldwide. Beheadings, mass executions, and enslavement shocked the globe. Suddenly, the war on terror was no longer about one man or one group. It was about a movement that had metastasized into something far more dangerous. For the United States, it was déjà vu. Troops were sent back to Iraq. Airstrikes targeted ISIS strongholds in Syria. Special operations forces hunted their leaders. Allies joined a global coalition to fight the group. The same cycle that had begun after 9/11 repeated itself: intervention, escalation, and uncertainty. At home in America, the shadow of 9/11 still loomed large. Security measures became permanent. Airports remained locked in strict protocols. Surveillance programs expanded, often sparking fierce debates about privacy versus safety. Many Americans had grown weary of endless wars, yet the fear of another 9/11 kept those wars alive. The younger generation, those who had been children during the attacks, came of age in a world shaped entirely by its aftermath. For them, 9/11 was not just a memory, it was the foundation of their reality. They had grown up under the Patriot Act, in schools that practiced lockdown drills, in a country constantly reminded of terrorism. The towers had fallen before they understood the world, but the consequences defined their adulthood. Meanwhile, the physical wounds of 9/11 were still present. First responders and recovery workers continued to suffer from respiratory illnesses caused by the toxic dust at Ground Zero. Many developed cancers linked to the chemicals they had inhaled while searching for survivors. The government eventually created programs to support them, but for countless firefighters, police officers, and volunteers, the cost of 9/11 lived on in their bodies. Ground Zero itself transformed into a site of remembrance. The 9/11 Memorial and Museum opened, with twin reflecting pools marking the footprints of the fallen towers. The names of nearly 3,000 victims were engraved in bronze, each one a story frozen in time. Visitors came from across the world, some in silence, some in tears, as they traced fingers over the names of strangers. For New Yorkers, the memorial was a place to grieve and to heal, but also a reminder that the scars of that day could never fully fade. Internationally, America's image shifted. In the early days after 9/11, much of the world had stood with the U.S. But years of war, controversial drone strikes, and secret prisons had eroded sympathy. Questions of morality grew louder. Had America's pursuit of justice crossed into vengeance? Could a war without end truly be called justice at all? Bin Laden was gone, yet terrorism was not. Afghanistan still bled. Iraq birthed ISIS. Syria burned in civil war. Pakistan remained a tangle of allies and suspicions. And across the West, lone wolf attacks inspired by extremist ideologies struck cities like London, Paris, and Boston. The spirit of 9/11 continued to haunt the world, not as a single event, but as an ongoing ripple. For Americans, the question became less about catching enemies and more about defining victory. What did winning look like in a war without borders? When could the war on terror truly end? Or was it destined to last for generations, reshaping nations and lives long after the smoke of September 11 had cleared? As the second decade after the attacks unfolded, one truth became painfully clear: killing Osama bin Laden had been a milestone, not a conclusion. The road that began on 9/11 was still stretching forward, winding into new conflicts, new enemies, and new uncertainties. And yet, through all of it, the memory of that clear blue morning in 2001 remained the anchor. The reason why soldiers marched, why laws changed, why towers of steel rose again where destruction once reigned. Because no matter how many years passed, America's story could not be told without September 11. 2 decades have passed since the morning when the skies above New York turned black with smoke. The images of planes crashing into the Twin Towers, of terrified people running through dust-filled streets, of the towers collapsing into ruins, they remain etched in memory, replayed in documentaries, classrooms, and in the minds of those who lived through it. Yet the true legacy of 9/11 is not only in those images. It is in everything that followed. For America, 9/11 was more than a tragedy. It was a turning point, a day when the country's sense of security was shattered. Before that morning, Americans believed oceans protected them from foreign wars. Terrorism was a distant problem, something that happened in other countries. After 9/11, that illusion vanished. The war had arrived on American soil, in the heart of its greatest city. The government responded with sweeping changes. The Department of Homeland Security was created, consolidating agencies under a single mission, to prevent another attack. The skies were never the same again. Airport checkpoints became symbols of vigilance, and of inconvenience. The phrase, 9/11 changed everything, was not just about geopolitics, it was about the daily lives of ordinary people. Civil liberties were reshaped. Surveillance expanded. The Patriot Act gave authorities unprecedented power to monitor citizens. Supporters argued it was necessary for safety, critics warned it was the death of privacy. Even today, debates rage over how much freedom should be sacrificed for security. Militarily, 9/11 unleashed wars that spanned decades. Afghanistan became America's longest war. Iraq became a cautionary tale of unintended consequences. The fight against terrorism spread across continents, from drone strikes in Pakistan to covert operations in Africa. Entire generations of American soldiers went to war, many returning with scars both physical and psychological. Thousands never returned at all. For the families of 9/11 victims, the legacy is more personal. Every anniversary brings ceremonies where names are read aloud, bells are tolled, and tears are shed. Children who lost parents that day grew up without them, their lives forever shaped by absence. Firefighters and first responders who rushed into the burning towers carried the burden for years, many falling ill from the toxic air. For them, 9/11 never ended. Globally, the ripple effects were profound. Countries reshaped policies around counterterrorism. Alliances were tested and forged. In some places, America was admired for its resilience. In others, criticized for wars that caused immense suffering. 9/11 became both a rallying cry for unity and a symbol of division. The attacks also reshaped culture. Movies, television, literature, all bore the mark of 9/11. Stories of heroism, fear, and loss became common. Songs mourned the dead or celebrated resilience. The skyline of New York itself became a canvas of remembrance. Where the Twin Towers once stood, the Freedom Tower now rises, a glittering monument of defiance. At its base, the memorial pools reflect the names of every victim, ensuring they are never forgotten. And yet, the most enduring legacy may be less visible. It is in the way people think. Trust and fear were redefined. Before 9/11, many Americans did not know where Afghanistan was, or what Al-Qaeda meant. Afterward, words like jihad, terrorism, and homeland security became part of everyday language. Suspicion lingered. Muslim communities across the West faced increased prejudice, despite their own condemnations of the attacks. Innocent people bore the weight of guilt by association. The attacks of 9/11 changed not only policies, but perceptions. As years passed, the memory evolved. For those who lived through it, 9/11 is a wound that will never fully heal. For younger generations born after, it is history, something learned through photos and stories, like Pearl Harbor or the Kennedy assassination. Teachers explain it in classrooms, parents describe where they were when the towers fell. The day remains a point of shared memory, but its meaning shifts with time. By the 20th anniversary in 2021, America faced a bittersweet moment. U.S. troops withdrew from Afghanistan, ending the war that had begun in the wake of 9/11. But the withdrawal was chaotic. The Taliban, once toppled, returned to power. Many asked, after 20 years of sacrifice, what had truly been achieved? The circle seemed complete, the war that began because a 9/11 ended with the same group ruling the same country. And yet, despite the tragedies, despite the costs, the spirit of resilience remains the central legacy. New York rebuilt. America endured. The world changed, but it did not end. In the stories of firefighters who climbed the stairs of burning towers, of passengers on Flight 93 who fought back against hijackers, of ordinary people who helped strangers escape the rubble, there lies the true lesson of 9/11. Out of horror came courage. Out of destruction came unity. Today, the question is no longer only about what happened on that September morning. It is about what 9/11 means in the present. It is about how nations choose to balance freedom and security, war and peace, justice and revenge. It is about whether the world will continue to be shaped by fear, or whether the memory of that day can inspire something greater, a commitment to resilience, to compassion, and to vigilance without hatred. As the sun sets on each anniversary, the lights of the memorial pools glow softly in the night. The names carved in bronze whisper across generations, and the echo of history remains. That one day can change the course of the world forever, but the choices made afterward define what that change means. This is the legacy of 9/11. Not only a tragedy, not only a war, but a story of loss, resilience, and the unending struggle to make sense of the day that changed America, and the world, forever.